Hey there, I'm Linus from Gravitee. Today we will be talking about Gravitee policies, a very important thing for the gateway in Gravitee to be able to help you doing transformations, orchestrations, access control, rate limiting, whatever logic you may want to have between your client and your actual API service. So Gravitee and other gateways typically sit between a client and an underlying service. So if we put the Gravitee gateway somewhere like this in a box, and then over here in this situation we have an HTTP flow. We're going to be covering HTTP, we're going to be covering event-driven APIs, so Gravitee can sit on top of things like Kafka and Solace and expose it with things like WebSockets and servers and events. So we'll have a look at how policies can be applied to those. And then we'll also look at how policies can be applied to Kafka protocol effectively. So you typically have a gateway sitting here in the middle, and then over here you have some sort of HTTP service. Maybe that is SOAP, maybe that is a REST service. And then over here you have a client. Now whether that is a machine or someone that is initiating a call. So you have two sort of flows here for HTTP APIs. You have the request flows that goes from the client to your backend service. And then the backend services response through a response flow. So we can just note that out as a request and response flows. So in Gravitee, what happens is you define something called a flow. So a flow is effectively a grouping of policies, such as rate limiting transformations, that are executed based on a couple of different factors. So first of all, in Gravitee, as we've talked about, you have the concept of a plan. So in a previous example, we had a plan that we called the gold plan. And the gold plan we had secured, in our case, with something like JWT. And then we also had a silver plan. So I'll point that up as well. Silver, and I think in that case, we were using an API key to secure that. Now what you can do in Gravitee is you can decide to have policies being applied based on whether a specific plan is in use, or you might have policies being applied regardless of what plan is being used. That is what we call common flows. So in my situation, I wanted to say that if you're using the silver plan, I'm going to be maybe enforcing things like rate limiting, etc. So what I'll do is you'll map down the different API contexts that you want the policies to be applied to. So on top of things like which plan is being used, you can determine that, oh, I only want my policies to be applied if it's a post operation, for example, and the resource in the API that is being used is /pet. So maybe we have a pet store sort of API. Similarly, for the silver plan, you might do exactly the same if you want to specify something specifically that you want to apply a policy on. So here again, I'm specifying that I'm going to be looking at post operations for the pet plan. So let's focus in this situation on applying policies specifically if the silver plan is being used by the application, and if it's an HTTP post operation to the pet store resource. So over here now, I can determine what policies in Gravitee are supposed to be added. So maybe on the silver plan, I'm going to say that, hey, when client makes a request through the Gravitee gateway, I maybe want to do something like add a rate limit policy to control maybe that the user is only allowed to do 10 requests per second, or whatever else it may be that I want to specify. And then I can chain these different sort of policies on the request flow. So maybe I want to say that actually I also want to customize the headers. So I might be using a custom headers policy in Gravitee to maybe extract something from the parameter into a new header that is then being sent out to the upstream service effectively. And then maybe I want to say something like when the data is returned back to the client, maybe this data here is in the XML format. but my client here really wants that in JSON. So maybe we'll have a SOAP API that you want to convert to REST, for example. So Gravitee has a lot of policies there that you can apply. So you can be using something then on the response phase that might, for example, be an XML to JSON policy that automatically converts that payload, for example. Or maybe you want to do some sort of monetization based on the response pool. Maybe you have a custom billing metric. Maybe it's based on the size of the message that a client is receiving. You want to invoice them or otherwise track the size of messages that clients are receiving. So maybe you're using something like an assign attributes or assign metrics policy to be able to capture different custom analytics that you can then use to build dashboards. So I think Gravitee has more than 80 policies that can be used here to apply different sort of authentication, security, transformation, and orchestration capabilities. And next, we will be looking at how you can apply policies to event-driven APIs. So next, let's put a checkbox next to HTTP APIs. And now we're going to be looking at event-driven APIs. So while there's a few similarities, one of the things that I'm changing out here is rather than having an XML or a SOAP or REST-driven backend, maybe this is a Kafka topic, for example, or maybe it's a Solace event broker, or maybe it's RabbitMQ. Let's imagine it's some sort of event-driven architecture over here that I want to be exposing through the Gravitee gateway to my clients. Now, maybe my client wants to use something like WebSockets, or maybe they want to use something like servers and events, or maybe webhook technology. That is what Gravity's gateway allows you to do. So rather than having a request and response flow, in Gravitee, we basically call this publish flow and subscribe flow. Because fundamentally, the architecture is a little bit different here. You're not sending requests and getting responses. You're typically establishing a connection and then either streaming data out or getting data into your event broker. So within Gravitee, the concepts are exactly the same. You have flows, you have plans, you have this concept of applying policies on different phases. But rather than having HTTP post and different methods that you define in terms of when you want policies to be applied to your flows, you typically talk about things like publish and subscribe, maybe both in some situations. So let's imagine very similarly, we have this civil plan and we have, let's say, a subscribe flow for a pet channel, not a resource, but a channel in the concept of an event-driven API. So very similarly, what you do in Gravitee is you'll be able to apply this concept of a policy. So let's say, for example, that I'm exposing data to my event broker and my client over here is only interested in the data if a particular value in the data record equals their preference. So maybe they're interested to stream different orders about purchases or something like that, and they only care if the order ID equals 1, 2, 3. So what you can do, again, you can apply the concept of a Gravitee policy. Maybe in this case, it would be something like a message filtering policy that basically filters out any messages that goes through the subscription flow to the client. So maybe here, I would say something like, I only want the data if the ID is 1, 2, 3, something like that. Of course, you can also establish similar flows for the publish phase or the initial connection phase, potentially, when the client is establishing the connection or when they're pushing data maybe over the WebSocket protocol. And again, you can do very similar things. You can do things like XML to JSON. Maybe you're having a client that can only talk in JSON, but you're using a schema registry and you need that data to be in Avro, for example. Again, the Gravitee gateway allows you to do those transformations, access control, validation, and so forth. Okay, we'll now tick the box for event-driven APIs on top of any event broker system. Last but not least, we'll look at specifically how Gravitee can expose Kafka brokers to clients having the Gravitee gateway basically appearing as a Kafka broker itself for clients that want to use Kafka protocol to interact with the event-driven system. So it's very, very similar in terms of having flows that are publishing or subscribing to data. In a matter of fact, there's also a other type of interaction here, which we call operations, which might be on different sort of Kafka commands, not only publishing and subscribing, but maybe creating topics, for example, or deleting topics, or other metadata-based operation that you might be performing on your Kafka cluster. Again, Gravitee policies in our Policy Studio with flows can be applied to the native Kafka protocol. So we have very similar concepts here in the sense of flows. We can have gold plans, we can have silver plans, we can have common flows applied to any traffic regardless of the plan used to authenticate. Now, similarly to HTTP and event APIs, you have the concept of different authentication schemes, but maybe in my situations, I'm using something like maybe MTLS for the gold plan, or maybe I'm using something like SSL plain, or maybe JWT for the silver plan. So again, you define plans with different authentication schemes that maps to the Kafka authentication protocol. And you can apply this concept of flows here. So let's say we have a silver flow here. I'm just going to call that, flow 1 or something like that. And that is ultimately what we will be creating policies for here. So as I said, you can do policy application when a client is publishing messages into Kafka. You can apply policies when clients are subscribing data from Kafka, and you can apply specific operational policies. For example, when someone is authenticating, maybe you want to do something like an ACL policy to control the sort of data that someone can access. So maybe here I'm going to be using an ACL policy in Kafka that allows Gravitee to check on the gateway using dynamic expression language whether or not someone should be able to allow access to topic A and topic B, for example, and then you can control which of those you allow. And maybe when you publish data to Kafka, maybe you want to enforce something like a quota enforcement that basically defines how much data a user is allowed to push through in terms of kilobytes per second, for example, into Kafka before it's blocked. Or maybe on the subscription piece, maybe you're using something like virtual topics, a concept that allows you to expose one particular topic in your Kafka broker, maybe that is topic A, but your client may need to see that as a virtualized view called topic B. Now with a virtual topic, you can basically map those topics together and maybe do something like filtering. So maybe say that, oh, my client over here only cares about the data in topic B if the headers in topic A equals a particular value. Maybe that's an order number, or maybe that's a region or a country for whether you're subscribing to updates. So again, Gravitee Gateway can apply these policies on flows using plans on HTTP calls, on event-driven APIs like WebSocket and service events on top of any broker like RabbitMQ, Solas, and Kafka, and so forth, or it can apply policies on the native Kafka protocol. Thanks for watching.